Dr. Smith, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today.
It's my pleasure.
With your permission, I want to launch into the subject as quickly as possible, but I also just wanted to ask you, could you briefly describe what you do on a daily basis in terms of, I know that you are involved in education and also teaching at a university?
Well, I actually divide my time between the State Department of Education here at Kansas. I'm the director of testing, largely a matter of psychometrics, which is the science of measurement. But that's not really my background. My background is in educational philosophy. I studied at the University of Kansas and had the good fortune of working under the last surviving member of the Integrated Humanities program at KU, Dr. Dennis Quinn. So I teach just about every semester there and have since 1999.
Okay.
So,
and so did I correctly understand that you're involved, in other words, when the students have to take their standardized tests? Is that what you're...
That is, yes. That's very, very far from what I used to. I also spent 10 years teaching high school literature. So it's not really something that I was formally trained to do, but I've fallen into this position, and yes, it's about standardized testing.
And then do I also understand that you also give lectures at the University of Kansas?
I do.
Okay. What are the subject of those usually?
Well, actually, they range. I've lectured on everything from human resource management to philosophy of education, everything from ancient Greek philosophy to modern philosophy to large-scale assessments.
Wow!
I'm fortunate.
I know you can't see me right now, but I have a big smile on my face. It sounds like you have all these areas you've had experience with.
Well, it comes with age. I can't say that I'm a specialist in all of them, but my first love and the area in which I'm most comfortable is, without a doubt, the humanities, and in particular literature.
My understanding is you are a convert to the faith.
I am.
I just wondered if you could briefly share a little bit about that, because it actually has a bearing on what we're going to talk about with the Mass propers, believe it or not. So if you could share a little bit about your conversion, that would be amazing.
Well, I fell in love. It's actually something that I have thought about, and I'm sure, as is the case with many people, it was a fairly circuitous route. But I fell in love with the church almost through the study of literature, through the study of philosophy. One might even say I fell in love with the church as an idea. Reading everyone from Hilaire Belloc to T.S. Eliot, Dante, a number of different people. Culturally, I was very, very far away. In fact, I think I was further away culturally than I was theologically, having been raised as an evangelical. And then after having reconciled myself to the church, I experienced the church not in theory or as an artifact of history on the page, but I experienced it in practice. And it was definitely another opportunity to learn. The church in practice was not the church that I necessarily experienced in literature, I'll say.
Well, and that's actually what I want to speak about. Well, let me ask you one more thing before we do that, though. Your wife, was she a Catholic?
She was indeed. And I was in fact, I was not a Catholic when we were married. And I was still, obviously, on my way, so to speak, but not yet there. So I promised at the point of our marriage, we had a Catholic wedding, and I had to agree to raise our children in the faith, which I did, but was not ready at that point to convert.
Oh, okay. Well, and again, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that, but am I correct in saying that you were already interested in the church, really, even before you got married?
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Well, moving back to what we were saying a second ago, like I say, you're mentioning all these amazing authors and everything that you're reading, it sounds like you have a high appreciation for language. And that's why I thought it would be nice to talk to you in the sense of, as has been noted numerous times in numerous articles by numerous people, when it comes to replacing the propers in the so-called Novus Ordo Mass, the post-conciliar Mass, what we replace them with, at the entrance, at the offertory, at the communion, would you agree that the quality of language is very low?
Oh, I would, and I think that's not necessarily an observation that requires a great deal of sophistication. I think my children are able to recognize that we are in a position such that we can move between the Tridentine Mass and the Novus Ordo, and I think even all three of my girls are able to sort of appreciate the fact that the language, say, in a Father Lassant's Missal versus the Novus Ordo Missal is just not the same. It's just not.
Because it seems to me that, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like it must have been difficult to read about the church, learn about the church, and then go into a church and you look at these texts. As you know, a lot of them are by non-Catholics. Some of them are even by unbelievers. And as I always point out, although people don't grasp the significance of this, most of those texts are written by people who have no training in text, in the sense of they're musicians, but they're writing paraphrases, they're writing reflections. And no one seems to care when I mention this, but to me it makes a difference. If you're going to have somebody write a text, wouldn't it be wonderful if they had training in literature, or if they knew Greek, or if they knew Latin, or if they knew Hebrew, or if they had... I mean, does that make any sense?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's an opportunity. Our message to our children has always been that, and this goes as far back often as just noting the way people dress for Mass. We often say that people will feel compelled to wear, say, for example, a tuxedo or a suit or a tie for a wedding, but not so much for Mass. And I think all of these things are integral. The language that we hear, the music that we hear, they all suggest to a person how he or she should behave, or how he or she should respond. And as I said, we have an opportunity on Sundays to participate in something beautiful, and part of what can be beautiful, and I think often isn't, is the language.
Mm-hmm. Well, and again, we are going to go specifically into the propers and some of the ways that we can look at fixing that whole situation and why they're being replaced and how they're being replaced. But I guess what I'm getting at is, I know you've been Catholic a good many years, but looking back and putting yourself back in that place, was there a time when you were attending Mass and just, like I say, reading the I'm sorry to use the term, the goofy texts that a lot of them are replacing the propers with, did you find yourself saying or struggling with the fact that on the one hand the church, the history and the theology is so lofty, but then you have these third-rate texts? I guess that's what I'm wondering about.
Oh, absolutely. And this may not be an answer to your question, and this may be speaking to my own, I'll just say, hang-ups, for lack of a better phrase. But I think I'm bothered by syncopation. So whenever I hear anything that is highly syncopated, especially played on an instrument with frets, I wonder, is this my own unique irritation, or is there something more universal behind this? And I think what the Church teaches in a number of, and I don't claim to be a specialist in this area, but I do think the Church teaches that no, there is something universal. There's something universally appealing about, say, an organ music as opposed to music on a guitar. I'm not dismissing the potential beauty on a guitar. I'm just saying that there have been times, often, that I think, and again, even my children know. They can experience music that is just not conducive to prayer. That it's a distraction.
Well, when you said that you're bothered by syncopation, I'm assuming you mean when you're at church, when you're at the sacrifice of Calvary.
Yes, I'm sorry. Not like, in general, but
not like at a prom dance or something like that.
No, not at a ragtime music festival. For the record, I love ragtime music.
Sure.
But not at Mass.
Yeah. It's I don't want to get off track here, but it's interesting because I've written a lot about piano music at Mass because I love piano. I studied piano. I went to school on a piano scholarship. I mean, my whole high school was nothing but studying the pianists and the great Joseph Hoffman, Joseph Levine, Godowsky, all the Rachmaninoff, all the great pianists of the past. I mean, that was my life for so many years. And playing the repertoire and playing juries every semester, 45 minutes of music memories. And so when I try to talk about this, I try to tell people I love piano music. I'm just saying piano music at church, that's a different question. And I'm never able to make it clear to them that I don't hate piano music. They just think I hate piano music. That's not the case. And so when you said a second ago that you love ragtime music, it reminded me of that because you love ragtime music, but you said in its particular context.
That's correct, exactly. And truth be told, I love guitar music as well. All three of my daughters play violin, and they love not just classical violin, but they also love bluegrass. But I think even at a very young age, I have a second-grade daughter. If I were to ask her, without even much context, which is talk to her about the appropriateness of bluegrass music, she would know. I think it's inborn in her that there's a suitability there for what we are doing at Mass that requires of classical music. Not to suggest that I would want to see violin either, although I think there's probably a place for that.
And it's, again, before we move on to the propers, I just want to say it's unfortunate that, because this came up in the other interview too with Father Guy Nichols, it's unfortunate that, for example, the movie directors, they get it right. They know exactly the right music for the right time, for the right scenes. But
absolutely.
In the church, we have not a clue. I mean, down here in Texas, we have mariachi masses, we have rap masses, we have rock masses, we have polka masses. It's amazing that you're training your children. Well, you're not even training them. You're suggesting that they just know.
Well, and I do have the advantage, as I said, going back to, and this is something that we have discussed, I'll say, in some of my classes. We read, for example, Plato's Republic, and obviously the Greeks understood Plato in particular, and the Republic talks about the various modalities of music and the effect that they have on human beings. The Mixolydian scale has a certain effect. The Dorian has a certain effect. And so I think at a certain point, you don't have to have read the Republic to understand or to have experienced that mode. I mean, it's a human thing.
Absolutely.
So, and you can see that in children. They will respond if you play very modern, loud, syncopated guitar music. Don't be surprised if people behave in a certain way. And the question then is, I guess, whether that way is appropriate for Mass. So I'm sorry, that sounds a little harsh, but...
Well, no, I mean, the thing is that it's difficult because we want to be sensitive and we want to understand where people are coming from and perhaps their lack of knowledge or training in music. I mean, we have to, account for that as well. I mean, but at the same time, I think there comes a point when enough is enough, and we have to start. What is the phrase? Talk turkey. I mean, we have to
right.
be frank about this. And with that, with your permission, I'd like to move on a little bit to the Mass propers in general. Before we did this interview, I had talked to you a little bit, and I had asked you the question: are you aware that at the Novus Ordo Mass, the Mass after the Council, in other words, the Reform Mass, that there are specific propers, and most of them, by the way, are identical, at least for the Sundays and the feasts, to the propers in the Tridentine Mass. And my question to you before was, are you aware of that? And I believe you were saying no.
No, I was not aware. No.
Yeah. And of course, how could you? Because they're never done. But
right. Well, I mean, as again, a general awareness of the difference in language between the Tridentine and Novus Ordo, yes. But and obviously in the rubrics and lots of differences, but specifically to the propers, no,
Yeah.
it was
Well,
not.
let me share with you a little bit of information and get your reaction to it, because I feel that if you are not aware of these things, there's probably a lot of other Catholics that are not aware of this. So, for instance, okay, first of all, yes, the propers, they're all there. The gradual, the introit, which can also be called entrance chant. There's no, both of the synonymous, you know. So you got entrance chant, gradual, Alleluia verse, offertory, and communion. They're all there. They're all given to us by the Church. Now, the difference is that after the council, in a sung mass, you are allowed to replace those with something else. So for example, for example, for the gradual, you don't have to do the gradual. You can sing it. You can sing the responsorial psalm. Or for the Alleluia verse, the Gregorian Alleluia, you can replace it with what's called the Gospel Acclamation, which sometimes is identical and sometimes not. But with the other three items, introit, offertory, and communion, we get into a whole bunch of confusing other areas. So, for example, let's just talk about the introit or the entrance chant. What's allowed is, the first option is the chant in the graduale romanum. Okay, you know, it doesn't have to be plain song. You can do it in any setting. You know, you could do a polyphonic version or whatever. But the fourth option is you go down the list, because you can use a graduale simplex, and I think there's another option too. But the fourth option says alius cantus aptus, which is translated anything else appropriate. And that's where we get this notion, everyone's doing that all the time. Everyone's doing fourth option all the time. They're taking all the propers and always doing, quote unquote, something else appropriate. Am I making any sense so far?
Oh, absolutely.
Because this was something that was added, like I say, after the council. Again, it's very difficult to talk about these matters because they're very complicated and each thing is a little bit different. For example, there is no offertory listed in the Missal, by the way. I mean, everything has a story behind it and we don't have time to go into it. But all I would say is that the Novus Ordo Missal was added piecemeal. It was released at various times, 1967, 1969, 1970, 1972, 1974. And so that's where a lot of this confusion comes in. But while they were releasing it, that fourth option was added. And I've never really been able to find out exactly who added it and when. But in the general instruction, it snuck its way in there. And boom, everybody started doing that. Because why would you, I guess this is my question to you, Dr. Smith, why would you go to the trouble, this is how some people think, of learning the assigned introit, or the text, when you can just replace it with anything else you want, right?
Well, and I think it suggests also the burden of explanation or the burden of proof as to why it should be replaced for something else, quote unquote, appropriate, is a fairly heavy burden, and it's obviously squarely on the shoulders of the person who wants to make the change.
Sure.
I don't know. Maybe there's a reason for that. I don't know.
Well, I mean, in other words, if a person understands, for example, that the introit for Easter has been the same as far back as we have any trace of anything, 7th century, probably many years before that, then the question, you have to ask yourself the question, why am I going to replace the same chant that has been sung since at least the 7th century with some other song that I like or I write or I compose or I choose? And as you probably realize, most people don't even realize that there is an introit. Now there are being some books that actually publish it in there. But, 90% of people don't realize that they're replacing the assigned proper. And you were mentioning the burden of proof. I feel that people could make a case, for example, at a school mass, if you can't prepare the introit, for example, because the students they're just not able to do that. I know the church wants congregational singing. I don't see a reason why you couldn't, for example, substitute a hymn, in that situation. But I guess my issue is, why are we doing this 99% of the time in 99% of the churches?
Right. I think that to me would be being sort of, I'll just say, ignorant of this, or not having realized it. Are people aware that a change is being made? And again, I was not. So yeah, I would agree completely that, for example, at a school mass, there might be some reason to change, but 99% of the time, I don't understand that.
Right, and what's horrible is I just talked to a priest in England last week, and it turns out that everyone's doing this all over the world, so it's not just America. And it also begs other questions in terms of, I mean, I remember one time a priest was talking about some bishops who were trying to get rid of the Sunday Mass obligation, and saying that, people should want to go to Mass. In other words, it shouldn't be a sin not to go to Mass on Sundays, and that's what they were discussing. But the thing is, I mean, as you well know, there's also a little thing called human nature. I mean,
Right.
I think, yes, we should want to go to Mass. We shouldn't be forced to go to Mass. But, at the same time, I think everyone would agree that provision there is a good one, that you have to go to Mass because of human nature. And so it's the same thing with the propers. Now we have this freedom. You don't have to do the introit. The Church allows you that fourth option of substituting anything else appropriate. So it'd be a mistake for me to characterize it as if people are somehow disobeying the Church. But at the same time, would you agree that maybe we should start looking at these introits? The texts are beautiful. I mean, well, you're familiar with them from the Tridentine Mass, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think any time, and again, I'll fall back on, I do have confidence that this is not, the beauty that is inherent in these is not something that can be appreciated only by those who have some sort of education in literature or have that as a quote-unquote interest. That's not the case at all. I think beauty is something that can be intuited. Children experience it; they know it when they see it. So absolutely, if given the option, and I don't know how that would be done or accomplished, proper A or this other piece of music, I think many people would choose the original proper.
Mm-hmm. And of course, you also just raised a question that people also unfortunately don't understand, which is that music and text is not the same thing. Music is one thing and text is another. And unfortunately, this provision doesn't really speak to either of those. And so we end up with something that's, usually not chant and usually a different text. And so it's, like I say, that's why these interviews always tend to go long. Even just defining our terms can take an awful long time. Just speaking to you now, though, you seem like you have some training in music, though. So.
Well, I guess as most people, I do. I have my mother is a musician, a pianist, and a vocal director, just retired, and so I spent a large portion of my life in symphonic bands and.
Okay.
So
then you probably understand the fact that music is one thing and text is something else.
Absolutely. And one sure way to create a strange, you can ruin great text by inserting it into a horrible
music.
And likewise,
Sure.
I think there needs to be some, going back to the Greek, some proportionality there between the elegance of the text and the elegance of the music. And I think that's something that going back to an earlier question, that's something that I've experienced too. Mm-hmm. Text that even if it isn't particularly elegant, is addressing one of the church's, one of the great mysteries of our faith. Mm-hmm. That is inserted in a song that may be syncopated.
Sure, absolutely.
And the lack of proportion there is just, it's distracting.
And I want to ask you one more thing about the language issue, but it's difficult too because people confuse language and antiquity. I remember listening to somebody was showing me what they consider to be ancient American Indian music, I guess Native American Indian music. And all of a sudden, I'm hearing the circle of fifths, and I'm hearing, obviously, common practice era tonality music that I know exactly when it was written because of the way that, but the language was Native American. And so they were saying, look, this goes back to, the year 1400. And I hated to tell them, the language may, but the music, I can tell you, could not have been written before such and such a date. And people just have no... Again, you sound like you have you mentioned you have musical training, but this is something that people cannot grasp. Honestly, I wonder, Dr. Smith, whether people really even know the difference between, for example, the year 1400 and 1600 and 900 and 1800. I mean, is that something that resonates with you in the sense of?
I suspect that's true. I'm certainly I do not. I mean, if the question is not just about the instruments that are being used, but the
not even just the music. I mean, just in general. I wonder if people can really tell the differences between what people had in the year 1400, the year 1700. I think with some folks, pretty much history is just a big mass of it's not today. Does that make any sense?
I would agree. Once you move back from the present, things become blurry.
Yeah, and I can just tell you as a music theorist, because that's my degree, the notion that, when you hear something, it's obviously from 1800, and then they try to claim that it's from the year 1200 or 1300. I mean, it just strikes one as ridiculous. But again, I'm just bringing this up in the context of these are all things that have a bearing on what we're saying, and maybe that's why it hasn't gotten through to people. But going back again, I'd like to speak to you, Dr. Smith, because you're interested in language, and you know literature, whereas I really don't have any training, I'm not a text person. I mean, I'm more of a music person, although I do appreciate the propers, because they're just scripture, as you know. But here's the thing. I'm going to go out on a limb here. It must be downright offensive for you to listen to some of these texts.
Well, it is sad because we have the phrase the USA Today, which, as you may know, as a newspaper is written to be used by people who live in a fast-paced world and need to read quickly and don't have much time to think about language, to appreciate language, and also in my job here in assessments, we talk about universal design when we design assessments. Well, universal design is a way to create tests that don't disenfranchise certain groups because they may use high frequency words. Well, that I won't go down that path, but much of what I see or what I think about when I look at these texts is the USA Today approach to language, or trying to avoid any language that might disenfranchise or underprivilege certain readers who may not have the vocabulary. And I understand that. We don't want to do that. But I also understand there's a big difference between what I read on a Sunday, and what the church has as a part of its history. It's just a big. Again, I go back to that we have an opportunity for beauty when we attend Mass on Sunday, and the question is, do we experience that, or is it something a little more journalistic? And I'm thinking about the language.
But isn't it also true? I mean, really, people are educated today in a way that they weren't educated in the year, 1500, 1300. The common person couldn't read for the longest time. And now it seems like we're going back to an even lower standard when we could actually almost raise the bar.
Well, I think that's true, and I think I do have faith that people will rise to the occasion. I think my approach has always been in the same way that if you set high standards in as a teacher, students will respond. And I think we have the opportunity, or the church has the opportunity, and it's not really a matter of setting high standards per se, but if you do raise the bar in terms of the language that is used, and that the expectations for music, the expectations for language, people will respond. And I think that goes back to an earlier point you made about the number of young people who seem to be moving into traditional the Tridentine Mass. I think they recognize it as something profoundly different from their everyday world. And they're drawn to the beauty, they're drawn to the language, they're drawn to the music. It stands out as something different, as it should.
Yeah. Well, and again, I don't know the answer. I guess the answer just lies in that we continue to pray, that we offer sacrifice, that we stay faithful. But I have to confess, it is so frustrating that no one cares about any of these issues, and that people like you and other good Catholics are subjected to really unnecessary things that they shouldn't have to be subjected to. Like we were just talking about the propers. What is so unsuitable about singing the scripture passages? I mean, you know them as well as I do. Puer natus est, a child is born. What is so unsuitable about reading scripture reading scripture at mass and meditating upon it? And it's just so all this is unnecessary, and I don't know what I'm trying to, as I mentioned, raise awareness of the propers, that yes, they still exist, yes, they still should be sung. But again, I just don't like seeing good Catholics subject to this. Let me give you one more example. There's a person who I know who never speaks bad about the church, never says anything negative. He's always positive. But even he, the other day, called me and said, because he was listening in a parish to these grown men in this parish singing music that was so effeminate. I think it was kind of a Broadway deal. And he just said, Jeff, I see these, because he's a big sports guy, and he said, Jeff, I see these grown men singing this sappy, just horrible music, and I don't know. Again, is there anything about that statement that resonates with you?
Well, again, I absolutely. I think it's something that music is experienced on such a foundationally human level that it makes it hard to pray. It makes it hard to participate in the Mass. And if the music is raucous, I'll say, too loud, if it's too heavily syncopated, or if the instrumentation is there, even if it might be a beautiful hymn, that the instrumentation is really poor, all of these things can have a profoundly negative effect on a Catholic. So yeah, I would agree completely.
And I know they're just doing their best. They're trying to sing along because they think that that's what the church wants. But it's just it's a travesty.
Well, and I also think along those lines that there may be, and this perhaps is maybe another discussion, but that we have a misunderstanding of what it means to participate. I think prayer is participation. Having the right posture of humility or reflection on what is taking place as a form of participation, I think, and it may be unique to the United States, that we fall sadly into this notion that participation means waving hands, or participation means bodily movement of some sort, as opposed to cognitive participation. And I think there may be some interaction between that and this issue of music.
Well, it's just speaking of that, I have to chuckle because I used to use the example. For example, the church wants the choirs and the church wants choirs to sing. Not everybody has to be singing everything at all times. The deacon sings his part, the priest sings his part, the congregation sings their part, the schola sings their part, the cantor sings his part. That's what the church wants, but there's a notion out there that unless everyone's doing everything all the time, that's wrong. And I used to say, the reason I was chuckling, I used to always say, well, you can participate the same way that you participate by listening to the priest's sermon, which is where you just sit and listen. But then the other day I was at a Mass and the priest came down out of the pulpit and started walking around during the sermon and kind of making everybody, like, asking people questions and making that into the sermon. So I guess I can't use that example anymore. Well, listen, again, I really appreciate you talking to me. I hope that in the future you'd consider coming on again, and I hope our conversation has been useful. I know it's an unwieldy subject. There's no question about that. It delves into so many different aspects of even what it means to be human.
Well, absolutely, and you're absolutely right in saying previously that no one wants to be critical of the church. I mean, goodness knows the church has enough challenges today in our world. But I think it's the responsibility of all Catholics to think out loud, to have good conversations like these to other Catholics, to their local priests, because it matters.
Absolutely, and you're right. Being overcritical of the church is of Satan, really. I mean, if you've ever known anybody who everything out of their mouth is critical of the church, that to me, that's not what we want. But like you just said, at the same time, enough is enough. This constant, not even being able to talk about these issues. I mean, So maybe we should wrap it up for now. I've probably gone on too long here, but again, I can't thank you enough, and I hope that at a future date you would consider coming on again.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.